Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 22nd of October 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen, 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
And we're going to get straight on with Mr. Khashoggi because his death is now admitted, Patrick.
It's admitted. Again, it's admitted, but still waiting for evidence of the body, still waiting for habeas corpus. But yes, there's been an admission, somewhat of an admission by the Saudi government.
Okay, well, there was a joint France-Germany British statement today. The violent death of Jamal Khashoggi within the premises of the Saudi Consulate General in Istanbul has been feared for many days, but its confirmation still comes as a shock. Nothing can justify this killing, and we condemn it in the strongest possible terms. Well, this, of course, as I say, this is a joint statement from the UK, France and Germany, Patrick. So we've now labelled the anybody that's involved in the rapid reaction mechanism, the rapid reaction force. And this, in a sense, is quite a dark development that we're having these joint statements in this way.
And so what is the rapid reaction force, Mike? It's the attribution of blame, and the messaging needs to be streamlined. And what are the three components? Are those the main components of the rapid reaction force by the government?
A common narrative.
Common narrative, attribution of blame.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so that's...
No proof required. They went on to say this, defending freedom of expression and a free press are key priorities for Germany, the United Kingdom and France. The threatening, attacking or killing of journalists under any circumstances is unacceptable and of utmost concern to our three nations. The threatening, attacking or killing of journalists and freedom of expression. Is this something that in this day and age you think is a priority of the United Kingdom, Patrick?
I suppose, except for when it happens in Gaza, or except for when it happens to someone who's promoting any narrative that's going against the United States, the UK and France, particularly in Syria. Serena Shim comes to mind. And many other journalists that were assassinated while working in Syria. So a little bit of hypocrisy there, Mike, in that statement.
Okay, well, in the meantime, Bloomberg's headline here is McKinsey is horrified that Saudi Arabia report may have been misused. And of course, now we're getting all the sort of blowback on Saudi Arabia itself and people wanting to dissociate themselves to Saudi Arabia very quickly. But what's McKinsey so concerned about?
This is a fascinating story. So McKinsey is a law firm. If you've ever seen the film Michael Clayton, you get an idea of what sort of law firm this is. They've got their hands and tentacles in just about everything you can imagine and are synonymous with the term deep state. So they're horrified that Saudi Arabia has used, or this report was used by the Saudi government, Mike. It was supposed to be an internal report by the intelligence-linked law firm McKinsey & Co. And they're just absolutely can't believe how the Saudi government would have taken this report, which was meant to identify who is influential in terms of political perspectives in Saudi. And of course, they went straight away when they got a hold of this and arrested some of the people there that were identified on Twitter, Mike. So would you be surprised? I mean, once this data is collected, once these reports are generated, and then they manage to get into the wrong hands, and then you have this situation in a despotic autocracy like Saudi Arabia. But there's a lot of these reports being generated, Mike. That's the interesting thing. But if you go to, well, the New York Times.
Well, here we've got the New York Times, and their headline is Saudi's image makers, a troll army and a Twitter insider. I thought the troll army was Putin's troll army.
No, Saudi does actually have a troll army.
So this is a real troll army?
This is a real troll army. I've also been targeted by these trolls, as have many people I know who have made any sort of criticisms about Saudi lining people up for executions. There's a female activist right now who's on the block right now, the chopping block, literally. And when we spoke about this on Twitter, we got attacked by a Saudi troll who was posing as a B-list celebrity woman in the United States, and I thought that was interesting. But so they do actually have troll armies, and what the New York Times puts in this particular report, Mike, is that they believe Saudi had a mole in Twitter who came into the company in 2013 and rose to quite a senior enough level to have access, back-end access to user data, which is normally confidential. So you can imagine the ramifications of this, Mike, if this person, this mole in Twitter from Saudi Arabia, is connected with the government, and you have activists who are maybe anonymously or not tweeting or criticizing the royal family on this social media platform. The ramifications of that are quite significant. But it does raise the question, Mike, how many of these moles are in these massive social media companies now, like Twitter, like Facebook, and other platforms, and is that an issue? Is that a problem politically for dissenters?
Well, indeed, and of course, as we've said, the British government in that statement claims that they're upholding the rights of freedom of speech and so on, but they're not doing anything. In fact, they're actively encouraging this type of thing. This is from ARC. They're saying one doctor's false claim was used to erase atrocities in Syria. And as we scroll down through this article full of tweets of all kinds, but we get reasonably far down the list and we get the heat map that keeps getting regurgitated by so many so-called academics who are looking at how Twitter is being used to provide an alternative narrative in many cases. And yet this type of thing is being actively encouraged by the British government.
This isn't very different from what McKinsey and Co. had generated in this report of political voices in Saudi Arabia. And if you go back to this heat map, Mike, that's exactly what they're doing. So this is just another representation of basically tracking dissent on social media. And in this ARC report, it's repackaged as Assadist propaganda. But really what it is it's a dissenting opinion or an alternative narratives to what is being pushed out by government, by mainstream media. In the case of Vanessa Beeley, and in the center of that heat map, it's the counter narrative of the white helmets. And some of us who have been on the ground in Syria, unlike all of these people generating these heat maps, I can say that it's not a counter narrative, that it's the truthful narrative of the white helmets. And the fake kind of fictional narrative is the one being put out by the mainstream media, by the governments that are actually funding the white helmets. Obvious conflict of interest there, Mike. But the main point, Mike, is what happened there in Saudi Arabia and what people are doing now with this technology of analytics, what these sort of crowdsourcing, open source projects that are trolling through data. It's about identifying dissent, identifying dissenting opinion, but using sort of almost military grade operations in terms of software and data, big data analysis in order to identify dissenting opinions, to track dissenting opinions. And then look what happened in Saudi Arabia, Mike.
So where does this leave Britain, France and Germany there? The hypocrisy is tangible if they're saying we stand up for the freedom of expression. They criticize Saudi Arabia for doing what they did to one particular commentator. And yet, admittedly, they're not at the point of killing dissenting voices in the West yet, but they're doing just about everything else to prevent them being heard. So the hypocrisy here is spectacular.
What they've done in the West is they're saying, well, these aren't dissenting opinions. These are people pushing fake news. This is how they've spun this narrative in the UK and Europe and the West, and in the battle or the great epic calling to fight and battle fake news, to tackle fake news, or should I do it like this, to tackle fake news, then everything's fine, it's all good. The only thing they haven't done is to do what Saudi Arabia is doing, is to start arresting people for using Twitter. But in terms of identifying, in terms of profiling people who are enemies of the state, there's no difference between what the situation in Saudi Arabia and what's going on in Western Europe and the United States. On that level, it's exactly the same. Okay,
in the meantime, headline in the Wall Street Journal here, Saudi money flows into Silicon Valley and with it qualms. Are there really any qualms, or are they quite happy to take this?
I don't see a big change in policy, Mike. The money levels, the dollar levels are just too high, Mike. However, Germany has announced that they will be suspending arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But the ridiculous thing about this made-to-order mass media narrative, Mike, is because of the death of one insider, that a country is willing, like Germany, to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but the ritual slaughter that's taken place over the last 3.5 years wasn't enough to get the German government to that point, and clearly not enough to get the United States or the United Kingdom to that point either. Far from it, in fact. But isn't it interesting, Mike, how this the herd mentality in terms of narratives and media goes, that there's just so much outrage over this one individual who's been recast as a reformer. But if you look at his record, he's neither, you can't really call him a journalist, other than maybe what he's been doing in the last couple to 24 months, at least in the West. In the Arab world, yeah, he's a well-known commentator. I wouldn't call him a journalist, though, because a lot of people would have classed him as a defender of the royal family, a defender of the Saudi establishment for many, many years. So, but it's interesting.
But we've got to remind ourselves of the other aspect of global hypocrisy, at least Western hypocrisy, and that is the fact that Saudi Arabia has had this human rights role at the United Nations.
Yeah, well, you mentioned last night when we were talking about this on the Sunday Wire, you mentioned Al Yamama and the, I believe it was it BAE Systems?
Absolutely. Yeah.
That corruption scandal in terms of bribes and bungs, cash and defense contracts. Well, as you pointed out, Mike, Saudi does have a lot of dirt on the UK, so you don't expect to really any roundhouse kicks coming from London against Riyadh. In that UN scandal that you just had on screen there, that is basically the UK trading votes in order to get Saudi the place on the head of the UN Human Rights Council. I mean, this is a country with a horrible human rights record. And so the United Kingdom there, David Cameron's government, just in the background trying to maneuver Saudi to the head of the UN Human Rights Council. And money was transferred, I believe it was £100,000 was transferred to cover the cost of the campaign for Saudi to gain that seat. So where did that money go? Was it returned? According to this article, that hadn't been resolved yet. But maybe it did at a later date, but feel free to correct us if that was resolved.
The question in the chat box, Patrick, is why now? And of course, it isn't a case of why now, because this has been going on for quite a long time. I don't think this can really be separated from the fallout with Qatar, from the arrest and the house arrest of other key people within the Saudi establishment, and a whole host of other sort of events which have taken place in the last 18 months.
No, this is there's a lot of moving parts here. Correct that you pointed out. You have Qatar, you have Turkey, you have ostensibly Khashoggi, all lined up on the same side of that paradigm. And all three of those, Qatar, Turkey, and Khashoggi, pro-Muslim Brotherhood as well. On the other side, you have Saudi Arabia, anti-Muslim Brotherhood. You have the Trump administration, pro-Saudi Arabia, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, you could say. Or maybe not on the CIA level. I don't think they care either way. Yeah, so we have a bit of a split going on there, Mike. So there's a lot more going on, I would say, below the surface here than the mainstream media are willing to let on, I think, at this point.
Well, speaking of Qatar, and just by coincidence, Gavin Williamson was hosting his Qatari counterpart, the Qatari Minister of Defence, over the weekend, because apparently the UK and Qatar's defence relationship is closer than ever. They spoke about the future defence relationship underpinned by the recently agreed partnership on a joint Typhoon squadron and Qatar's acquisition of the aircraft. So we're talking about arms sales. So it doesn't seem that the UK is going to worry too much about whether they have to sell a few less arms to Saudi Arabia, because they're busy doing deals with their neighbour. So as part of the visit, the Qatari Defence Minister visited BAE Systems in Wharton and also in Salisbury to cut steel, officially marking the start of production of the first Typhoon jets that they're going to take ownership of. Well, there you go. The dirty deals continue to be done.
You have, yeah. It's another fireplace sale. Chalk that up for Mr. Williamson. But just to wrap that up, Mike, Qatar is no angel when it comes to their support of radical terrorism in Syria. We're talking about, at least according to the Financial Times, and by the way, this was in 2015 or 14, this article, $3 billion to the rebels in Syria. This is from Qatar. And we know that those rebels groups were terrorists now. So that's, you could say a good portion of that $3 billion going to arms for terrorists in Syria. And so we have, a Western defense minister, absolutely no qualms shaking hands on whatever deal's going, because it seems that money trumps morals, and money trumps all the anti-terror rhetoric that we've been hearing for so long. So just wanted to point that out.
Well, over the weekend, yesterday, Liam Fox was in New York, and HMS Queen Elizabeth, our new aircraft carrier that has no aircraft of its own, was hosting a UK-US International Trade Day. So because it can't operate as a fighting ship, it's there to deal with trade instead. And what were they doing? They're hosting a number of trade events to secure trading ties between the UK and US businesses. This is all about our future relationship post-Brexit. They're going to host a round table bringing together a number of the UK's world-leading cyber companies, and they're going to present their technology and software to US Fortune 500 companies in an effort to secure deals there. So, Liam, what did Liam Fox have to say about this? This trade day will see some of the UK's most innovative businesses meeting their US counterparts as we continue to combat growing overseas cyber threats together. So there you go. That's really, well, what is it? Is it a trade meeting? Is it a defense meeting? It's certainly an extension of soft power, perhaps, to some degree.
But it's a strange mix, Mike. Trade and cyber threats.
Trade and cyber threats.
Trade and cyber threats.
Liam Fox went on to say his International Economic Department is currently consulting on the potential of future free trade agreement with the US, and has strongly encouraged British businesses and the public to make the most of this opportunity to share their thoughts on what the deal should include. So there you go.
I leave that up, Mike. I think this is a new trend in politics. Let's call it, what do we call it? Shawarma politics. Just throw everything in there. Throw it in trade, cyber threats, whatever. What else is in there? Defense. Yeah, throw that in there as well. But wrap it up and a little bit of tzatziki sauce, and away you go.
But whatever amount of money they spent on HMS Queen Elizabeth was clearly money well spent if they go to New York and end up with a couple of £1 million worth of cyber deals. Yeah,
it's an expensive platform to sell off of, though, isn't it? An aircraft carrier.
Absolutely. Right. Let's talk about Mr. Netanyahu. Now, this is going back a few months to March, I think, and he was given a speech to AIPAC in the United States, and he was telling the world about how great Israel is in terms of its technology and absolutely at the top of its game.
Driving the world.
Driving the world.
That's the words he used. Israel is literally driving the world. He was talking about their role in driverless cars. So something to look forward to, that many of those driverless cars will be powered by Israeli tech. So you can rest assured when you're taking your long journeys in your Google car.
Well, we were talking about cyber threats a second ago. It's not really fair to say, is it, that Israel is at the top of the world, or running the world in this area, because lots of other Middle Eastern countries are bringing forward scientific and technological advances. Iran, as this article highlights. But one area where Israel is at the forefront is with cyber, and for example, Checkpoint, probably the ubiquitous firewall product on the face of the earth, and it does amuse me slightly, Patrick, that when we've got the United States and the UK sort of concerned about Chinese smartphones and the potential for the Chinese to be spying on us through our Chinese smartphones. In fact, just about every major corporation, or even smaller corporations on the planet, have Israeli firewall software at the border of their network. Every packet of data that goes in and out of those networks is passing through an Israeli product, and we don't actually know because it's proprietary, we don't know what potential there is there for Israeli spying on.
No, and it's not like they have a record of spying on the U.S., for instance. Israel does. But if you go back to that slide, let me just point out, just last week, Netanyahu decreed what he called the fantastic decade. This is the fantastic decade for Israeli science leading the world. But in fact, this latest report shows, Mike, that in terms of peer-reviewed literature, Iran in the Middle East, Iran is now #1. They've overtaken Israel. #2, Turkey. #3, Saudi Arabia. And #4, Israel. And Iran has overtaken Israel in key fields like biochemistry, genetics, and molecular biology. Iran is increasing access for women and other young people in terms of research and science. Meanwhile, Israel is cutting those programs in its school, according to this report, and instead opening classes on women's empowerment, Mike. And so cutting edge science and education is happening in Iran, but Israel is spending that money building new settlement homes in the West Bank, and also cutting schooling hours for ultra-Orthodox students. So a little bit of a very different than the rhetoric that Netanyahu was talking about last week. The numbers don't seem to reflect his rhetoric.
Okay, well, we're going to move on then. And before we do, let's just have a quick reminder of Alternative View 9.1, Democracy in Chains, taking place on Sunday, the 2nd of December 2018 in the Crown Plaza Hotel, Kensington, in London. Tickets are available from alternativeview.co.uk. You'll be speaking at that. Remind us what you're talking about.
We're going to be talking about the sort of creeping fascism, Mike, in terms of the increasing corporate involvement in government decision-making, and specifically we're going to be looking at the area of censorship, which seems to be quite a hot topic right now.
So also speaking, Dr. Graham Downing, Brian Gerrish, Alex Thompson, and Ian R. Crane. So get along to that if you possibly can. Now, this week sees the start of Trident Juncture, the NATO exercises. This is 50,000 participants, 31 allies and partner countries. And this is considered to be the largest, most important military exercise that NATO has run since the end of the Cold War. It's called Trident Juncture 18. It begins on the 25th of October, which I guess is Thursday, but there were some advance elements which took place, they describe them as advance elements, they took place in Iceland at the end of last week. Now this is all about collective defence under Article 5, and it portrays a threat from a fictional near-peer adversary in the northeastern flank of the alliance. Now, there's only one near-peer adversary on the northeast of the alliance, and that's Russia.
I thought it was the Eskimos.
Well, I don't know, but they claim that this is a fictional near-peer adversary. So why have they chosen the northeastern flank? Well,
they might be actually just a Freudian slip there, Mike. Maybe it is fictional, because I don't think Russia is actually planning on attacking Europe, Mike.
Well,
so there's a little bit of a Freudian truth in that text.
May well be the case. They say the robust participation of Canada and the United States alongside European allies will be a visible demonstration of the transatlantic bond and allied unity and resolve. So that's fantastic stuff. I'm feeling inspired. 150 aircraft, 65 ships, 10,000 vehicles deployed for the live exercise. Finland and Sweden, who are not NATO members, are among NATO's most valued operational partners, and they will participate in this live exercise. And they say that the northern flank of the alliance was once a key concern for Cold War planners, but until recently it's seen little NATO attention in the post-Cold War era. Meanwhile, Russia, the traditional challenger in the north of Europe, they say that the reason for this was because Russia was mired in economic difficulty and in the early stages of complicated military modernization process. But they're saying that because these factors have diminished or changed, grand strategy, state competition and geopolitics have once more emerged as a concern in Europe and the North Atlantic. Therefore, this major exercise is a timely effort by NATO to relearn some key training lessons from the past and prepare for current and future threats. So that is fantastic. Now, one of the things which is being tested in this exercise is the idea of a military Schengen. So can the EU work together to get troops moved from one part of Europe to another with no border delays, no delays of any kind. And so you'll be pleased to know that hundreds of British Army troops have successfully completed an epic road move. This is what the British government is saying, an epic road move to Norway, where they're now going to begin training with allies ahead of the exercise Trident Juncture formal kickoff, which is on Thursday. So there we go. Here is Mark Lancaster, and he said, with the Arctic and far north becoming increasingly militarized, it's now more important than ever to train across a range of challenging environments. This exercise will truly test our ability to deter any aggression we may face in an era of intensifying threats. I don't think there are any real intensifying threats here other than the ones that we're making up for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much sums it up. I think it's interesting that, did you say Sweden and Norway or
Finland?
Finland and Sweden, they're not members of NATO.
That's right.
But they are valued operational partners and taking part in these drills, and they're pressed right up against Russia, so they're being used as cannon fodder for NATO. So they're not members, but they might as well be, Mike, because they're taking part in these provocative drills, and they're actually the ones actually sharing that northeastern border with Russia. So how good of NATO to allow them to participate in these wonderful drills. But the bigger question is, Mike, when we watch that wonderful footage, do you think the Russians are frightened by seeing middle-aged Scandinavian generals patting each other on the back, or these other things going on in the films? I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. So if that's meant to be a show of force, yeah, I don't think so. Anyway.
Well, look, let's move on to nuclear matters then. And of course, the news came out over the weekend was that Donald Trump has threatened to tear up one of the non-proliferation treaties, claiming that the Russians are in breach, and that really that he has no option but to tear this up. And just by coincidence, then Mr. Bolton is in Moscow today. Isn't that correct? To discuss this very matter. So. Is this a genuine tearing up of a treaty, or is this another one of Trump's position statements in running up to a proper negotiation?
Well, you have to look at how this argument is structured, and the U.S. is claiming that Russia is in violation. What is their proof for this? Well, they can't show it. It's top secret, classified intelligence that their Russians are working on something that's in violation of the INF nuclear agreement. But by the same token, the United States could say that the U.S. missile defense system that it's deployed along Eastern Europe's border with Russia, that those are capable, those units, those missile launchers are capable of medium to long range missiles as well. So they could probably make, the Russians actually have a stronger argument prima facie that the United States or the West is in violation of this treaty than the U.S.'s argument that Russia is in violation of the treaty. I think, Mike, that this particular, the significance of this isn't actually the INF treaty. I think the big prize is actually the AMB treaty, which is the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which the U.S. pulled out of and doesn't like to talk about very much. But that's actually the most important thing. If you consider, Mike, between two nuclear powers, the most important argument is the doctrine of the mutually assured destruction. So in a MAD doctrine or mutually assured destruction, the offensive missile capability isn't exactly the #1 prize. That's a given that both sides, the U.S., Soviet Union back then, Russia today, both sides would have offensive capabilities that could conceivably wipe each other out. Therefore, the real danger between superpowers would be in missile defense. That would throw off the balance of power in the MAD doctrine. But in this case, if you just want to look at this from a purely political point of view, not strategic, Donald Trump might be angling for a new deal. And I think this is probably very realistic, that he's basically, the Trump administration is looking at all of these, they've reassessed all trade deals, all defense pacts, all multilateral agreements, and looking for weaknesses in all of these and preempting the situation by highlighting these. In this case, it's the INF Treaty, and you can make the argument that because China, because India, maybe even throw Iran in there if you want to, or even Korea, North Korea, for instance, they're not signed up to these treaties, but they should be. So in other words, there's an argument for the modernization of the INF Treaty, and I think this is a canny political move by Donald Trump, because going into the 2020 election, what he's most concerned about is achieving a win. So he wants a big W to go into the campaign with, to say, look, I'm performing on the international stage. I've done a peace treaty with North Korea and South Korea. I've revamped the most important nuclear treaty, bilateral, multilateral treaty in history. I've done that, et cetera, et cetera.
And do you think there's a possibility then that the whole all his rhetoric, which is anti the Iranian deal, could be with a view to bringing Iran into this process?
To this process, yeah, but in terms of the JCPOA, maybe another process as well. But certainly the biggest gripe the United States has with Iran is, one of the biggest gripes is their missile capability, Mike. So I can see that being potentially wrapped into this conversation too, although it's not nowhere near on the scale or capability that Russia, China, or even India has.
Okay, now just leaving defence, I just wanted to introduce everybody to Alison Stevenson, a very important lady. She since May 2015, she has been Director, Head Office in the Ministry of Defence, responsible for the financial and corporate management of the head office, and she's also the gender champion for the Ministry of Defence. But before that, she was head of NATO and Europe policy at the Ministry of Defence. She was responsible for UK defence policy objectives for international security organisations and for developing defence bilateral relations with European allies and partners, which was a role, they say, which required extensive cross-government and international engagement. So, in other words, she was one of the architects, for example, of the Franco-British treaties, which were signed in 2010, and other bilateral defence agreements with the Netherlands, with Germany, with Italy, and so on, right at the core of European Defence Union, therefore. Now, she initially trained with the Ministry of Defence as an electronic engineer, so perhaps you wonder how she managed to get into this position. So she's clearly one of the chosen. She has undertaken a range of senior policy and corporate roles in the department. She has now been appointed as the first ever Director of Overseas Bases. Now, what this seems to us to mean is that this is part of the joint command at Northwood. This is where EU military unification infrastructure is based. And if she has been appointed as the first Director of Overseas Bases, this means that overseas bases have been hived off into a separate legal entity. She's been made Director of that. That makes it a very easy little package which can then be rolled into some other infrastructure, European unified infrastructure in the not too distant future. This looks like some kind of quasi-privatization of foreign assets, or our assets abroad, I should say.
Well, you only have to look at a number of other major departments under the MOD, even in the nuclear deterrence section. Mike, a company like Serco will be running large sections of the operation, whole facilities, in fact, maybe even bases. So that's not unusual in that respect. But the more interesting question is how she advanced from electronics into such a lofty leadership position, Mike. And one of the only possible answers for that is that she's gone through the leadership training system there. So she definitely would probably believe in a common purpose, let's say.
She may well do.
In terms of whatever the agenda is.
And speaking of corruption, today is the International Anti-Corruption Conference for this year taking place. Well, there you go, nice picture. Together for Development, Peace and Security. Now is the time to act, apparently. So now is the time to act against corruption. They say that corruption in increasingly complex forms is eroding fair and democratic governance around the world. Violence against activists, journalists, and citizens who speak out against injustice and corruption is on the rise, all too often with impunity. These dangerous trends call on all of us from north to south to work still more forcefully towards sustainable development, security, and peace. The UN Sustainable Development Goals guide us in this endeavour, and the fight for better governance and against corruption, highlighted in Goal 16, lies at their heart. This is the time to turn promises to combat corruption and promote transparency into action. It's time to focus on promises made at conferences and conventions near and far, taking stock of progress and gaps. So that's fantastic. So the British government, ahead of this conference, has announced a number of things that they're doing. Some of what they're describing as wide-ranging measures to tackle corruption at home and abroad. They're going to urge countries to follow the UK's lead and ensure every company registered in their country publicly discloses the real owner. They're going to they have apparently seen that the government of Ukraine is going to sign an agreement with Open Partnership, which is a Department for International Development funded organisation that's working to build a global beneficial ownership register. So now we've got Ukraine getting involved in that. That's good stuff, isn't it? That's going to deal with corruption. And they also have announced funding aimed at furthering the UK's world-leading work on anti-corruption and international illicit finance. £2.6 million of support for the International Budget Partnership, which is an organisation that reports on the transparency of government budgets. Apparently this helps measure global progress on budget transparency and tackling corruption. And £2 million contribution to the International Organisation of Supreme Audit Institutions Development Initiative. That sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it?
None of this is this for UK and US?
This is
European corruption, or is this for banana republics and the frontiers of Eurasia?
Well, apparently we are one of the least corrupt countries on the planet, so we don't need to worry about it too much. We've got our beneficial ownership database being set up quite nicely, so we don't need to do too much more. This is mainly for international partners, emerging international partners.
So if you, Mike, if you do a freedom of information request to a government asking for some audited accounts for the tens and tens of millions of dollars that have been shoveled into the coffers of the white helmets, for instance, and the government doesn't want to answer those questions after repeated FOIA requests, Mike, would you say that's the sort of situation that this organization here, this International Anti-Corruption Conference, is that a sort of thing that they would be covering at that event?
Well, no.
Why not?
Well, this is a very good question because that type of corruption isn't sort of real corruption, or this is the type of corruption that a totally transparent government like the British government refuses to talk about.
Okay, so what about the Dutch government, who were funding the white helmets, Mike, and they stopped funding recently? They announced they're freezing all of that because they couldn't guarantee where the money actually went to, because they were using the Hawala payment system, which is a informal cash voucher system, the same ones that drug dealers, arms dealers, human traffickers, terrorists, organ traffickers, the same system they use. So their Dutch government were a bit afraid, Mike, that all their public money that was going to help the white helmets was getting mixed in amongst all those other strange illegal activities. And who's to say, Mike, that the government, the money coming from the UK government wasn't utilizing the same Hawala payment system, Mike? But it'd be easy to find out, wouldn't it? Because we have submitted FOIA requests, right?
Well, it should be easy to find out because as a response to somebody else's FOIA request, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office admitted or claimed that the White Helmets produce a quarterly financial statement explaining where all the money went, what it was all spent on. But if you ask the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for a copy of, for example, the most recent quarterly report, they don't want to give that. And in fact, it's come to such a state that at the moment, with regard to funding for the White Helmets, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office will not acknowledge receipt of any communication from me at all. So that is with the Information Commissioner at the moment. And whether they will make any progress on this, I don't know. But it has got to the point where I've been waiting since February for the answer to some of this. And they aren't refusing to answer it. They're simply not responding at all. They're absolutely in breach of the legislation. And I find it a fascinating development, particularly in the light of this, particularly in the light of our opening story today. The sheer hypocrisy of this is unbelievable. They say that everybody else has to conform to X, Y, and Z, but the British government is not required to conform to any of that.
Wouldn't this make a great workshop and a panel discussion for the International Anti-Corruption Conference, Mike? I think it would be very engaging and fascinating for the attendees and for the delegates, Mike, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
It might even be the most interesting topic if they decided to mount such a panel and such a workshop on this. I think it'd probably be the most exciting and the most interesting.
I suspect it's not on their agenda.
Yeah. So anyway.
Okay, well, we will leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for joining us, Patrick. We will be back at the same time on Wednesday, 1 p.m. as usual, and we will see you then. Bye-bye.